Ekaterina Sholokova let him into her home in the autumn of 2019, and at the time, it seemed to her like the best decision she had made in years. The man had come from far away, from Altai. He was 33, he carried himself calmly, said the right things, and, importantly, did not dismiss her youngest daughter. Ekaterina told her friends the same thing, over and over, repeating it like a mantra. He is good, he treats the younger children well. And it was this phrase that everyone who heard it would later remember, replaying it in their heads and trying to understand whether she believed what she was saying herself and whether she knew something that those around her did not. But then, in the autumn of 19, no one asked unnecessary questions, because everything looked exactly as it should look when a man finally appears in the house of a lonely woman. Nedovo is 18,000 people in the Tver region, a small town where everyone knows everyone and where any news spreads in literally a day. Ekaterina lived here with her 2 daughters. The elder was already a student, almost an adult, but the younger one, Vikica, was still in school. Vikica had hearing problems from birth, an officially registered disability, but at the same time, she studied normally, was friends with her peers, kept a social media page, and from the outside, it looked like a perfectly ordinary life of an ordinary family in an ordinary provincial town. Ekaterina herself was 40 at the time. She was pulling everything alone: work, household, both daughters, and there had been no man in this picture for a very long time. So, when he appeared, the neighbors noticed the same things. A normal guy, doesn't drink, doesn't cause scenes, helps around the house, fusses over Vikica, and doesn't get irritated. He got a job at the local water utility, settled into Ekaterina's apartment, ate at the same table with her daughters, and the first few months passed absolutely peacefully. No alarm bells, no oddities, nothing that would make anyone suspicious. Or maybe all of that was there, but no one paid attention or heard it. His name was Nikita Silnov, and, as would later be revealed, Ekaterina knew almost nothing about him that she really should have known before letting this man into her home. In a year and a half, Vikica would be gone. The town would begin to ask the mother questions, and the answers she would give, Nedovo would never be able to accept. On February 5th, 2021, Ekaterina was hospitalized for planned treatment. Nothing serious. She knew she would only be there for a few days, so she wasn't particularly worried. The eldest daughter was studying in another city at the time, and Vikica stayed at home, and he was with her. For a year and a half, they had lived under one roof, and Ekaterina saw no reason for concern. She called Vikica before going to the hospital, told her to listen, to behave well. It was a perfectly normal conversation, like hundreds they had had, and it turned out to be the last one. Exactly what was happening in the apartment on the evening of February 5th has never been fully established. Vikica was at home, Silnov was there, and at some point, something happened between them. A word, a phrase, a reaction. Later, the investigation would reconstruct the picture and establish that Vikica had somehow found out that he was going to leave her mother, and this news made her happy. She told him this directly, without hiding her emotions, and that turned out to be enough. He threw her onto the sofa, took off her scarf, and tightened it around her throat. Vikica could not resist for long. She simply had no chance. After that, Silnov stood up, walked through the apartment, took her phone, bank card, some of her things, and calmly left. On February 6th, she was discovered. Vikica lay in the same place, on the sofa, with a scarf around her neck. She never lived to see the next morning. Ekaterina was informed of everything right in the hospital, exactly how it happened. No one later recounted in detail. It is only known that she refused to believe it and kept repeating that this could not be, that he would never have done such a thing. Silnov had already disappeared from the town by then. His phone was switched off. No one had seen him. The police first declared a regional search and then raised the case to the federal level. Nedovo was buzzing. In the school where Vikica studied, classes were cancelled. Classmates wrote farewell words on her page, and the funeral was set for February 9th. The town was seeing off someone everyone knew, while simultaneously searching for the person the mother herself had let into her home. For 3 days, Silnov could not be found, and for all those 3 days, Ekaterina remained alone with what had happened, with the questions her neighbors and acquaintances had already begun to ask her, and with answers that she either didn't have or preferred not to give. And so, to understand how all this became possible at all, one must go back a little to Vikica herself, to what she was like, and to what she didn't know about the man who had lived in the room next to her for 1.5 years. Vikica was born in 2007 and grew up right here in Nedovo. Her hearing had been bad since birth. Not total deafness, but problems serious enough to register a disability. In school, she sat at the front desk. Teachers spoke louder when addressing her, and classmates had long since gotten used to it and perceived her simply as Vikica, without any special labels. She didn't drop out of social circles, didn't withdraw into herself. Her social media photos showed an ordinary teenager. Selfies, school photos, something with friends. Nothing special and nothing alarming. Just a girl living her life at an age when everything is still ahead. Senior, grades, graduation, first love, some plans for the future, and she hadn't even really had time to think about what she wanted to become. In Nedovo, the path for people like her was more or less clear. First school, then a technical school or college somewhere in Tver, and then either work in town or an attempt to move somewhere further away. Nothing grand, but nothing terrible either. An ordinary life in an ordinary place. Vikica lived with her mother. Her older sister visited rarely, and their father had been out of the family for a long time. What she herself thought about this, and how she experienced it, remained only with her. So, at some point, the mother was fired from her job. The circumstances of this would become clear a bit later. And for the time being, the family lived on the disability allowance Vikica received. The money was not much, but in a small town, it somehow sufficed. They managed. Vikica went to school, returned home, did her homework, sat on her phone, waited for her mother to come home, and so the days passed, one after another, not particularly differing from one another. And then he appeared in their house. How Vikica felt about this, no one will ever know now. Whether she said anything to her mother, complained to her friends, or felt something wrong about this man, all of that went with her. But to understand why this man ended up near her at all, one must look more closely at the mother, at her loneliness, at her choice, and at the chain of decisions that ultimately led to what happened in February. By Nedovo standards, 40 is already an age when counting on something new in one's personal life becomes difficult. 2 daughters, no husband nearby, and who their father was or where he went was something the town either didn't know or preferred not to discuss out loud. At the same time, Ekaterina was not from an underprivileged background. She had an education, a job, her own apartment. She didn't drink or party, and she conducted herself steadily. And in a small town, such things are valued. But respect is not at all what you want in the evening, when both daughters are already asleep and you are sitting alone in an empty kitchen. Ekaterina worked in the EFSIN system, that is, the Federal Penitentiary Service. In the village of Monino, very close to Nedovo, there is a correctional colony, and Ekaterina held the position of head of the office there. Papers, documents, records. The work was not heroic, but it was stable, with a government salary, a clear schedule, and a seniority pension. For a woman in the provinces, this was a very good option. Many in Nedovo worked harder and earned less, and Ekaterina could afford to raise her daughters. She educated the eldest and sent her to the city. She provided treatment for the youngest, took her to doctors, and overall managed everything that had fallen on her. But the years passed, and 40 is the age when you begin to understand a simple thing. If something doesn't change now, it will never change. The daughters will grow up and leave. The apartment will remain. The job will remain. But there will still be no one nearby. And in a small town, this is especially difficult because there are few men, even fewer among them are single, and the normal ones among the single can be counted on the fingers of one hand. Some drink, some have been married for a long time, some have left for where there is normal work, and those who remained, as a rule, come either with baggage or with problems. There is practically no choice. Ekaterina understood all this perfectly well, just as she understood that looks are not eternal, that time is running out, and that the chance of meeting someone suitable becomes smaller with each passing year. This was not despair, but cold and simple arithmetic. She wanted a normal life, to have someone at home when returning from work, to have someone to talk to and share an evening with, so that the daughters would have a male figure nearby, an example, a support, a protection. This was especially true for Vikica, who was growing up without a father and who needed such a figure most of all. This is not weakness. It is a basic human need, and millions of women want exactly the same thing. The problem was not the desire itself. The problem was where and how she decided to realize it, because it was then, in 2018, that he appeared in her life. No one in Nedovo really knew where he came from. He just appeared, and that was it. Not a local. His accent was strange. He told little about himself and answered questions briefly and in general phrases. The neighbors quite quickly noticed that Ekaterina had someone new, a man. Not a young guy, but an adult, 30-some years old. And he looked quite normal, dressed cleanly, carried himself steadily, clearly not one of those who run out in the morning looking for a drink to cure a hangover. Silnov knew how to make an impression on people. He didn't talk too much, didn't pry with questions, greeted the neighbors, nodded when meeting them, was not rude and didn't make noise. And in the provinces, such people are valued, because a quiet man without quirks is a real rarity. With Ekaterina, they looked like a normal couple. She was 40, well-groomed, serious, and he was 7 years younger. But at the same time, he behaved like an adult. He didn't hang around her neck, didn't sit at home idle, went to work every day. The salary was small but stable, and in a small town, this is immediately noticed. He works, meaning he's normal. He doesn't drink, meaning she's lucky. He doesn't shout, meaning they can live together. And so, after his appearance, Ekaterina literally blossomed. Her friends saw it. She changed, became calmer, more confident, and something appeared in her eyes that wasn't there before. Either hope or relief, or simply the joy that she was no longer alone. She didn't tell anyone how they met, or she told something very general, without details, and no one particularly insisted, because in the provinces, it is not customary to pry into someone else's personal life. She found a man, good for her, and the rest was her business. Silnov behaved as if he had always lived there. He settled in very quickly, knew where the store was, where the pharmacy, where the post office. He greeted those he had seen more than once, didn't stand out, and didn't attract unnecessary attention. People attributed his taciturnity to his character, because not everyone likes to talk about themselves, and no one dug deeper. No one checked anything. Why? If the person works, doesn't cause trouble, and doesn't hurt his woman, what else is needed? He was liked not only by Ekaterina. He generally knew how to be liked, how to be convenient, inconspicuous, correct, and very soon became part of their home, entering where Vikica lived, who knew nothing about him, as, for that matter, did the whole town. At first, he stayed for the night, then began to stay for the weekends. And then his things simply appeared in the closet, a toothbrush in the bathroom, slippers in the hallway, and all this happened gradually, bit by bit, without loud decisions and without conversations like, let's live together. Simply, at some point, he no longer left, and Ekaterina saw no problem in this. The relationship is developing. That's normal. A man is nearby, that's good. He works, brings in money, helps around the house. And what else, essentially, is needed? Their apartment was small, a standard layout, 2 rooms, a kitchen, a combined bathroom. Before that, 3 people lived there, Ekaterina and both daughters, but the eldest had left to study. It became more spacious, and now Silnov had effectively taken her place. Vikica remained in her room, and through the wall now was her mother, with the new man. And in such an apartment with thin walls and small space, literally everything is heard. Conversations, footsteps, the sound of the television, there is simply nowhere to hide. Everyone is constantly in each other's sight. For a teenager of her age, this was not easy. A strange adult man in the house, not a father, not a relative, but just someone her mother brought in, and he now lives here. Walks down the corridor, sits in the kitchen, uses the bathroom, watches television in the living room. Whether anyone asked Vikica how she felt about all this is unknown, but most likely not, because adults rarely ask teenagers about such things. If they decided, then that's how it should be. She'll get used to it. Ekaterina was sure that everything was right, that they now had a real complete family, that a man in the house was protection, stability, a normal life, that is everything she had wanted for years. So, she did not check his documents, did not look for any information, did not ask acquaintances in the system what kind of person this was, and where he had come from at all. Maybe she trusted him. Maybe she didn't want to know. Or maybe she was just afraid that the answer would destroy what she was so diligently building. Several months passed. Silnov had fully settled in and become one of their own. He knew where everything was, how the stove worked. When Vikica returned from school, He ate at the same table with everyone, watched movies with them, and sometimes stayed with Vikica when Ekaterina was delayed at work. It became a routine, ordinary, domestic, unnoticeable, and a stranger gradually turned into a part of their daily life, someone who is simply there and who is always nearby. At the water utility, he didn't last long. He quit himself or he was fired. Versions on this matter differ, but after that, he began to sit at home. Ekaterina was also no longer working. She had left the FSIN. It turned out that there were 2 adults in the apartment without an income and without any employment, and money was brought into the family by only one source: Vikica's disability allowance. In essence, she was supporting 2 adults. Formally, of course, no. The allowance went to the mother's card. But, in fact, the family lived exactly on this money. Neighbors saw them together on the landing, in the yard, in the store. Ekaterina and her new man, Vikica and her stepfather. That is exactly how they were perceived, and that is exactly how they looked. Like an ordinary family from an ordinary house. The neighbors formed their own impression of this family, and they would remember it later. The neighbors later gave testimony to investigators, told what they saw, what they heard, what they remembered, and the picture for everyone was roughly the same. Nothing special. Silnov took out the trash, went to the store for bread and milk, carried bags from the car when Ekaterina brought groceries. That is, he did all those ordinary male chores that are so missed when there is no man in the house. He was seen in the yard rarely. He was clearly not one of those who sit on a bench with a beer and discuss politics with neighbors. He went out, did his business, returned back, without extra talk and without hangouts. He was also periodically seen with Vikica together, in the store, on the street, at the entrance, and no one noticed anything strange in this. They walked side by side. Sometimes he said something to her. She nodded in response. He didn't shout at her, didn't pull her by the arm, behaved calmly, exactly how a stepfather should behave. One of the neighbors later recalled an instance when he helped her carry a stroller to the 3rd floor. There was no elevator in that building. She asked, and he didn't refuse. He lifted it, set it down, nodded and left. Didn't even wait for her to say thank you. Later, this woman told the investigators, a normal guy, polite, who would have thought. And so, other neighbors confirmed exactly the same thing. Yes, polite. Yes, quiet. No scandals were heard from the apartment, no shouting at night. They lived like everyone else. Television, sometimes music, sometimes conversations in the kitchen. The walls in that house are thin. Much is heard. But there was not much to hear there. He didn't stand out, and that, in fact, was the whole trick. Not too friendly, not too withdrawn, not too talkative, not too silent. Exactly in the middle, where the eye doesn't catch, and where no unnecessary questions arise. So, people usually see what they expect to see. A man lives with a woman and her daughter, works, helps around the house, doesn't drink, meaning he's normal, meaning she's lucky, meaning everything is fine. Silnov understood this perfectly, or perhaps felt it intuitively. He knew how to look correct, how not to arouse suspicion, how to become part of the landscape that no one notices and no one pays attention to. But if everything really looked so harmless, the question arises, were there at least some signals, moments when something didn't add up, alarm bells that someone could have heard, but simply didn't give them importance? In hindsight, everyone begins to look for such moments. And the signals really were there. This was the first alarm bell. An adult man who doesn't work and lives off someone else's payments. In a normal situation, this raises questions. But Ekaterina, apparently, didn't ask them or asked them and received answers that for some reason satisfied her. The second signal concerned his behavior because Silnov became noticeably irritable. Neighbors noticed this. He was no longer as calm as before. Sometimes he went out into the yard with a stony face, and sometimes loud voices came from the apartment. Not shouting, but clearly tense conversations. Something in their lives was changing. So, the investigation would later establish an important detail. Silnov was using synthetic substances. When he started, how often this happened, and where he got them is not known for sure. But by the time of the tragedy, he was already an addict. Such substances change a person greatly, make them unpredictable. Bursts of aggression, paranoia, loss of control appear, and signs of all this can be noticed if you know where to look. Did Ekaterina know about this? Did she notice anything strange? Dilated pupils, sharp mood swings? Or did she attribute everything to fatigue, unemployment, domestic problems? We will never know. And how Vikica felt next to this person, whether she said anything to her friends, classmates, older sister, whether she complained about him, whether she asked her mother to break up. There is no direct evidence. Vikica didn't keep diaries, didn't write about it on social media. But one fact is known for certain. When she found out that Silnov was going to leave her mother, she was happy. She wasn't upset, wasn't afraid for her mother, but was specifically happy. And this says a lot. She felt bad next to him, maybe scared, maybe just uncomfortable. But she was clearly waiting for all of this to finally end. The months passed. Silnov remained in the house. The relationship soured, the money ran out, the tension grew. And then, in February of 21, Ekaterina ended up in the hospital, and Vikica was left alone with him. There are no details about Ekaterina's diagnosis in the case files. It is only known that it was a hospital stay for several days, nothing urgent. A planned hospitalization of the type that is scheduled in advance and prepared for. Ekaterina knew she was going to the hospital. It wasn't an emergency ambulance in the middle of the night. She had time to prepare, time to think about how to organize the household, and time to decide the main question: what to do with Vikica during these days. Vikica was no longer small. She went to school herself, heated up food herself, did her homework herself. But leaving her completely alone for several days was risky, especially considering the hearing problems, especially in winter, when anything can happen. Someone needed to be nearby, an adult and reliable person. There were few options at the same time. The eldest daughter couldn't drop everything in the middle of the semester, or could have. But the mother didn't ask her. Relatives, if they existed, are not mentioned in the case files at all. Either they didn't exist, or relations had long been severed, or Ekaterina simply didn't think about them. Because why look for someone on the side when there is a man at home? That left Silnov. He had lived in this apartment for a year and a half already. Knew Vikica, knew her schedule, knew where everything was, and formally was considered a member of the family, the stepfather, as the neighbors called him. That is, exactly the person who should look after a stepdaughter when the mother cannot do it herself. Ekaterina saw no problem in this. Yes, relations had been tense lately. Yes, he didn't work. Yes, he could be irritable. But this is Nikita, the same one who helped around the house, who greeted the neighbors, who had never raised a hand. So, she trusted him. After everything she knew about him, she still trusted him, and this would later become the main question of the entire case. Exactly what did she know, and how could she trust him, knowing that? But then, in early February, the question did not stand that way. Ekaterina packed her things, gave Vika instructions, left money for groceries, and went to the hospital. Ekaterina had to decide with whom to leave her daughter, and she decided. She chose the only adult who was nearby, a person she herself had brought into this house, a person about whose past she knew much more than anyone else in this town. And she left Vika with him, alone, for several odd days. The decision was not agonizing, and that, essentially, was the whole problem. Ekaterina did not sit up at night weighing options, did not call relatives, did not ask friends, did not look for a nanny for a few days. She simply accepted what seemed obvious to her. Vika would stay at home with Nikita, as usual. Friends theoretically could have taken Vika in, but in practice, who would take a strange teenager with health peculiarities when they have enough of their own worries? And besides, it was awkward to ask. It would have meant admitting that you don't trust your own partner, bringing out of the house what should remain inside. Neighbors were not considered at all. Strangers lived in the entrance. Not friends, not relatives, just those you greet on the stairs and nothing more. So, Ekaterina did not look for alternatives, because for her, they simply did not exist. Silnov was part of the family, the stepfather, the man she entrusted with her home, her bed, her life. And why not then entrust him with her daughter for a few days? She repeated this to neighbors, and perhaps to herself, as a defense against any doubts. And this phrase worked. It muffled the anxiety if any suddenly appeared, explained the choice that seemingly didn't require explanation, and made normal what was not actually normal. For a year and a half, she lived with a person about whom she knew things capable of changing everything. For a year and a half, she convinced herself that the past is the past, that people change, that she was lucky and he had changed. And when the time came to leave her daughter with him, she didn't hesitate for a second. On the morning of February 5th, Ekaterina packed her bag, hugged Vika, and said something ordinary. "Listen, behave well, I'll be back soon." Vika nodded. Maybe said something in return, or maybe just waved her hand. The mother left the apartment. The door closed behind her, and Vika remained on the other side of that door, alone, with a person she wanted to see leaving their lives. With a person who knew this perfectly well, alone with Nikita Silnov. February 5th, evening, an apartment in Nedovo, and inside are two people, Silnov and Vika. Exactly what was happening in those hours, no one knows for sure. There were no witnesses, no cameras in the apartment either, and only Silnov's own testimony remains, which he gave during the investigation. It can only be believed partially, because those who commit such things rarely tell everything to the end. According to him, the day passed completely normally. Vika returned from school, ate, sat on her phone, did her homework or didn't. He didn't follow that. Each was busy with their own thing. Two people in a small apartment who did not want to be near each other. Silnov, by that time, was already under the influence of substances, and his state was extremely unstable. He could outwardly seem calm, could seem normal, but inside something was already shifting. Vikica could not see this, or saw it, but didn't understand what it meant, because at her age, adults often seem simply strange, irritable, taciturn, staring at one point. So what? She was already used to such things. And so, at some point, a conversation happened between them. How it started is unknown. Maybe Silnov said something first. Maybe Vikica asked about something. Or maybe what had long been accumulating between them simply hung in the air. So he was going to leave. Leave Ekaterina. Move out of this apartment. The relationship was falling apart, and both felt it. Vikica told him about her joy right to his face. For her, it was a way out, the end of a year and a half when a stranger lived in the house. The end of the tension, the end of the fear, if it existed at all. She was waiting for this moment, and when it came, she simply couldn't keep silent. Silnov heard this, saw her face, and realized that she was happy at the very thought of his departure. That for her, he was not a stepfather, not a family member, but a nuisance, a problem, someone she wanted to get rid of as soon as possible. For a person under substances of this type, this could have become anything: an insult, a betrayal, a threat, a trigger. What happened next that evening? Silence, a quarrel, an attempt to go to their rooms. How much time passed between that conversation and what happened afterward? All of this remained unknown. And behind the wall was a person who had already made a decision, or had not yet made it. But the substances were already doing their work. And then came the night. The exact time remained unknown. The night from the 5th to the 6th of February. An apartment in Nedovo. 2 people inside, and only one of them would live to see the morning. Silnov would later tell the investigators that it was a flash, sudden and uncontrollable. He didn't plan anything of the sort. So he said, it just hit him, and the aggression that had built up inside finally found a way out. Vikica, possibly, was already asleep, or was not yet asleep, and was sitting in her room with a phone in her hands. He entered, and what was said between them, if anything was said at all, remained only between them. Then she ended up on the sofa, then the scarf tightened around her throat, and then silence fell. The difference in strength, in weight, in age was too great. He held until she stopped moving. It took a few minutes, or maybe less. When it was all over, Silnov stood up and walked through the apartment, and his movements were methodical. The investigation would later reconstruct this picture in detail. So he didn't call an ambulance, didn't call the police, didn't inform Ekaterina of what had happened. He simply left, closed the door behind him, and disappeared into the night, leaving her there on the sofa in the same position. On February 6th, someone raised the alarm because Vikica didn't answer calls and didn't get in touch. For the mother, who was in the hospital, this became a serious cause for concern, and she asked someone to check the apartment, called neighbors, acquaintances, everyone she could find. The door was opened. They went inside and saw what they saw. The apartment looked normal. No signs of a struggle, no ransacking, only silence, and Vikica on the sofa, motionless, with a scarf that still remained on her neck. They called the police, then investigators arrived, then experts, and the apartment turned into a crime scene. Nedovo found out about everything that same evening. News of the terrible event spread through the town. But the one who did it was no longer around. Silnov had disappeared. His phone was switched off. He left no traces and vanished as if he had never existed there. He left at night, took what he could carry in his hands, and walked out of the apartment without saying anything to anyone. And there was, essentially, no one to tell. Nedovo at night is an empty town. The streetlights burn every other one. The streets are deserted. There are almost no cars. And leaving unnoticed at such a time is not difficult at all. Silnov knew the town well enough not to get caught by random witnesses. A year and a half here was quite enough. The first hours after such an event are the most important. The police know this perfectly well, and the one who committed such an act also understands it. Before they missed her, before they discovered her, before they announced a search, there is a head start, a few hours, maybe half a day, and that is enough to go far. Silnov didn't wait and got out of the town that same night or early in the morning. Exactly how, the investigation established later. A bus, a ride, on foot to the highway. There were different versions, but the main thing was that he was moving toward Tver, 150 kilometers to the east, to the regional center where it is much easier to get lost. He took Vikica's phone with him, but didn't use it. The SIM card, most likely, he threw away somewhere along the way, and his own phone he had switched off back in the apartment. He tried to withdraw cash from the bank card, but there turned out to be almost nothing there, a few thousand and no more. He fled light, without any preparation, no stashes, no connections on the outside, no plan. 12 years behind bars is 12 years without a normal life. He didn't really know how the world was arranged on the outside, didn't know how to use modern services, and had no friends who could hide him. So, on February 6th, when Vikica was discovered, Silnov was no longer in Nedovo. The police arrived at the scene, inspected the apartment, questioned the neighbors, and the picture came together quite quickly. The mother's partner is absent. His phone is unavailable. The main suspect is obvious. The Ministry of Internal Affairs announced a search, first local in the Nedovo district, then regional throughout the Tver region, and when it became clear that he could have gone far, they took the case to the federal level. Wanted posters with his photograph, descriptions, and last known location were sent to all departments. In Nedovo, the police worked around the clock, questioning everyone who could know anything at all. Neighbors, Ekaterina's acquaintances, former colleagues from the water utility, checking connections, calls, correspondence, looking for any lead. The town followed the search with great attention. News spread instantly through social networks, messengers, through conversations on the streets. Everyone knew what happened. Everyone knew who they were looking for. And Silnov's photo was published literally everywhere with the note, "If you have seen him, call." For 72 hours, he remained at large. For the police, this is an eternity, because every hour is a chance that he will go even further, cross the regional border, reach Moscow, and disappear in a city of millions, get on a train, and end up at the other end of the country. He had time, but he didn't have resources. The police, meanwhile, worked according to the standard scheme. They checked relatives in Altai, contacted colleagues there, but no one had seen him, and no one was waiting for him. They checked acquaintances from the colony, those who had been released earlier or later than him, and also a dead end. There remained only one city he knew more or less well, and that was Tver. He grew up there, committed his first crime there, was tried there, and for a person without connections and without money, it was the only familiar place. So, the logic here is simple. People in a state of stress return to where they feel at least a little confident, even if it's dangerous, even if it's stupid. The brain automatically searches for the familiar when everything around is collapsing. The Tver police received the description among the first. They increased patrols in the center, checked stations and bus terminals, went around places where a person without money could spend the night. Abandoned buildings, basements, heating mains. It was February, cold, and one cannot last long on the street in such weather. In parallel, work was carried out with surveillance cameras. In 2021, there were already quite a lot of them. Shops, ATMs, apartment entrances. Facial recognition did not work everywhere, but it was already present at major points. They combed through the recordings, looking for matches with the description. Silnov, meanwhile, did not hide professionally. He did not change his appearance or avoid cameras. He simply wandered around the city, trying to survive, sleeping wherever he could, eating whatever he found, and waiting for goodness knows what. Perhaps hoping that somehow it would resolve itself. On February 10th, he was spotted. Exactly where this happened is not specified in the case materials. Whether a patrol recognized him from the description, a camera recorded him, or one of the citizens called and reported him. But the result was the same. Silnov was detained. He did not resist and did not try to run. He just stood and waited while they put handcuffs on him. There was nowhere left to run. He was taken to the station, then transferred to a temporary detention facility. And then the interrogations began. The investigative committee worked quickly. The detainee was processed and fingerprinted, all according to standard procedure, but with heightened attention, because by that time, the case had already become high profile. Cameras, protocols, every step was recorded. Photographs appeared the same day. Silnov in handcuffs between two guards, a hollow gaze, a face without any expression, neither fear nor remorse. The very man who a few days ago had inflicted injuries on Vikica incompatible with life. Looking into the camera, and nothing. People in the comments tried to see something in those eyes. Malice, madness, some sign that they were looking at a monster. But they found nothing. An ordinary face, an ordinary man, the same one neighbors called normal. On February 11th, a court hearing took place at the Moscow District Court of Tver. The investigator filed a motion for arrest. The prosecutor supported it, and the defense presented no objections. It was a formality, but a telling one. Even the lawyer understood that no one would release this man. The judge issued a decision. Detention for 2 months until April 7th, with the possibility of extension if necessary. Silnov was taken to a cell. But before that, he was brought back to Nedovo for an investigative experiment, a standard procedure in cases of particularly grave crimes, where the suspect shows on-site exactly what happened and how. The escort was reinforced. The police and investigators were wary because it was a small town. People were agitated. Vikica was known here, and Silnov was hated. Someone could well have tried to carry out vigilante justice. Officers were on duty in the streets near the house, keeping bystanders away. So he was led into that same apartment. The sofa where Vikica was found, the room where it all happened. And Silnov walked calmly, showing the investigators. I stood here, she sat here. Here I knocked her down. Here I tightened the scarf. All this was filmed on video, every word and gesture recorded. and later fragments of these recordings would reach the press. People would watch and not understand how one could so calmly demonstrate exactly what they did to a teenager. In the courtroom, where the preventive measure was chosen, was Ekaterina. She came herself and looked at the man who had inflicted injuries on her daughter incompatible with life, at the man she herself had chosen, lived with, and trusted. What she felt at that moment, she told no one. Silnov was taken to a pre-trial detention center, a cell, bars, waiting for trial, and the case was only beginning. And during the interrogations, he began to speak. Meanwhile, investigators began to dig, not just in the direction of where he had been hiding, but also into who he actually was, where he came from, and what his life was like before Nedovo. And what they found about Nikita Silnov changed everything. The database check took only a few hours. Name, date of birth, location, standard procedure, and the result came quickly. It was such that investigators read it twice. Nikita Pavlovich Silnov, born 1987, previously convicted under Article 105, Part 2, a grave offense, 15.5 years in a maximum security colony. He had caused similar consequences before. The year 2007, Tver, city center, an apartment building, an ordinary entrance. Silnov was 20 then, young, healthy, with a future ahead. A neighbor on the landing, an adult woman, and exactly what happened between them, what started it all, is in the materials of that case, but it was never widely published. The result was horrific. He inflicted injuries on her right there on the stairs, with his bare hands or something that was at hand. Details in various sources differ, but the woman did not survive on the spot. And that wasn't all. That neighbor had a daughter, young, almost an adult, and she happened to be nearby, either by chance or trying to help her mother. Silnov tried to cause serious consequences for her as well. He grabbed her, dragged her to the stairwell, the 6th floor, intending to throw her down. She caught the railing, held on, and survived, one might say, by a miracle. He was taken quickly then, nowhere to run, trial, sentence, transfer. For a 20-year-old, that was almost a third of a life behind bars. And then it seemed fair. It seemed like a long time. But the system works by its own rules. So, in the colony, Silnov behaved in an exemplary manner. He worked, did not violate the regime, received rewards. His character references were positive. The administration did not complain. And on paper, he looked like the ideal prisoner, one who had set out on the path of reform. In 2019, he applied for parole. His documents were in order. His time served allowed it. There were no violations. The commission reviewed it. The court approved it. And after 12 years, he was released, with the remainder of his term assigned as a suspended sentence. He was 32 years old, and a whole life was ahead of him again. He left the colony that same year, and it was that very colony in the village of Manino, near Nedovo, the very one where Ekaterina Sholikova worked as the head of the office. Investigators put 2 and 2 together. The dates matched, the place matched, and the story began to take on a completely different shape. Silnov didn't just appear in Ekaterina's life out of nowhere. They met there, in the colony. She was an employee of the system. He was a prisoner under a grave article, and something arose between them even before his release. She knew from the very beginning what he was in for. She saw his file, read the verdict, understood exactly what he had done in 2007. And still, she let him into her home, to her daughters, to Vikica. This information reached the press in literally a matter of days, and the reaction was exactly what one would expect. The news spread in literally 24 hours. First local social media groups, then regional media, and then federal publications picked up the story. The headlines were each more terrifying than the last. Tver region, schoolgirl, recidivist stepfather. This story attracted everything that makes such cases viral. A small town, a defenseless victim, a man with a past, and a mother who allowed it all. The comments under the news numbered in the hundreds at first, then thousands, and people wrote what they thought, without filters and without any sympathy. She brought him in herself. She traded her daughter for a convict. What kind of mother leaves her child with such a person? She should be tried too. It's her own fault. Hatred poured out in both directions, at Silnov and at Ekaterina. But if Silnov was the obvious evil, the mother became the object of a special anger, the kind people feel toward traitors, toward those who should have protected, but did not. In Nedovo, they knew her. They knew where she lived, where she worked, who she was. And now, all that knowledge turned into a weapon. Neighbors who used to greet her on the stairs were now giving interviews to journalists, telling what they saw, what they heard, adding their own details and speculating. The town split into two camps. Some considered Ekaterina a victim, deceived, in love, not understanding who she had involved herself with, while others called her an accomplice who closed her eyes to the obvious for the sake of a man in her bed. It was then that information about her dismissal surfaced. Ekaterina did not leave the federal penitentiary service of her own accord. She was fired for a relationship with a prisoner, which meant that the colony's management knew about their relationship, warned her, and tried to stop her. She did not stop. She waited until he was released, took him in, settled him in the apartment where her daughters lived, and continued what she had started behind bars. These details finished off the last doubts of those who were still wavering. It was not a chance meeting, not a deception, not a story about how she knew nothing. A question hung over this whole story. It was asked in every comment, in every discussion, in every conversation on the street. How? How could one do this? What was she telling herself? How was she justifying it? What did she believe in? There was no answer yet. Ekaterina remained silent, having survived a loss that she herself had made possible. But before searching for answers to all these questions, it was necessary to find the one who did it all, because Silnov still remained at large. Silnov spoke a lot during interrogations. Investigators wrote it down, recorded it, clarified details, and he did not deny anything, did not get confused in his testimony, and did not try to shift the blame onto someone else. He admitted everything. His version of that night was simple, perhaps too simple for what happened. A flash. He repeated this word over and over, a sudden flash of aggression, uncontrollable. He didn't plan anything of the sort, so he claimed. He didn't intend to cause harm. It just overwhelmed him. The blame for everything, according to him, lay with substances. Silnov described his state during that period. Constant irritability, flashes of rage out of nowhere, a complete inability to control himself. That night, Vikica told him what she told him, and for a person in such a state, it turned out to be enough. He snapped, and after that, according to him, there was a blackout. He remembers everything in snatches. The investigators listened and took notes. They didn't believe him, but they conscientiously recorded every word. The flash version was convenient for the defense. A state of passion, the influence of substances, diminished control. It doesn't negate the charge, but it can affect the final sentence. And Silnov or his lawyer understood this perfectly. But the investigation was interested in something else, not just that night, not just how and why. They were interested in the whole chain, how he ended up in that house in the first place. So, Silnov told them. He and Ekaterina met in the colony. At first, they just saw each other. Then they started talking. Then something more appeared. He didn't elaborate on the details, but the picture was clear enough. The investigators asked directly, "Did she know what he was in for?" Silnov did not hesitate with the answer. Yes, she knew, from the very beginning. She worked with the documents and saw his case, the article, the sentence, the circumstances. Everything was in the papers that passed through her hands. He spoke about it quite calmly, without trying to blame her, without a desire to drown her, simply stating a fact. She knew and made the decision to be with him, waited for him to get out, took him in, settled him in the apartment where her daughters lived. The investigators clarified. Did they ever discuss his past? What she said about the 2007 case? Silnov replied, they discussed it once, at the very beginning of the relationship. He told her his version of events, what happened, why, how he explains it himself. And Ekaterina listened and said she believed him, that people change, that the past is the past. They never returned to this topic again. For the investigation, this was enough. The testimony was recorded. Silnov had said his piece. But this was his version, his words, his perspective on his relationship with Ekaterina. To understand the full picture of what was happening in this family, it was necessary to hear her. Ekaterina did not speak immediately. For the first few days after it happened, she was silent. Hospital, shock, a complete inability to accept what had occurred. Then the interrogations began. Investigators, protocols. She had to answer questions, and her answers were eventually heard by everyone. She did not blame Silnov. The investigators expected something else entirely. A mother who had lost her daughter, a woman betrayed by the person she completely trusted. It would have been logical to hear hatred, curses, demands for the maximum punishment. But they heard something else. Ekaterina characterized him as kind and caring, as a good father to her daughters, as someone who helped around the house, who didn't raise a hand, who always behaved decently. She spoke about him as if nothing had happened, as if he was still the same person she had once brought into her home. You wouldn't say by looking at him that he's capable of such a thing. This phrase was later quoted literally everywhere, in articles, in comments, in discussions, and people couldn't believe it. Is she actually defending him after everything that happened? But Ekaterina went even further. During one of the interrogations, she put forward her own version and told the investigators, what if Vikica herself? What if it wasn't him? What if she herself tightened the scarf around her own neck? The investigators looked at each other and wrote it down. The version was absurd because experts had already established the full picture of what happened. The marks, the position of the scarf, the nature of the injuries, and everything pointed to one thing. It was done by another person, an adult, strong, the one who was nearby. But Ekaterina voiced this out loud, on the record, and effectively tried to remove the blame from the man who had inflicted injuries on her own daughter, incompatible with life. So, when this became known, the reaction was absolutely predictable. The hatred that had previously been divided between Silnov and the mother now concentrated entirely on her. People didn't understand, couldn't understand, didn't want to understand. How can you defend the one who took from you the most precious thing? What must be in a person's head to utter such a thing? What kind of blindness? What kind of dependency? What kind of distortion of reality must occur for a mother to behave this way? In the court where the preventive measure was chosen, Ekaterina was present, looking at Silnov. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't demand justice, just sat there. Journalists later wrote that she behaved as if she had come to support him, not to bury her daughter, but to support him. After this, the town turned away from her completely. In Nedovo, she became an outcast, the one who chose this man instead of her own daughter, the one who still cannot admit the obvious. But one question still remained unanswered, the main question of this entire story. And then what Ekaterina had been hiding from the beginning became known. She knew. She didn't guess. She didn't suspect. She didn't hear it from someone else later. She knew from day one, from the very moment she saw him in the colony and decided she wanted to be with him. Ekaterina Sholokova worked as the head of the office, and the documents of every prisoner passed through her hands. Personal files, verdicts, character references. She read them in the line of duty, and she read his file as well. Ekaterina saw those lines in black and white, an official document with signatures and stamps. Not rumors, not conjectures, but facts established by a court. And she chose him, not in spite of what she knew, but specifically knowing, understanding, holding in her hands the papers in which it was described what he was capable of. She looked at this man and decided, with me, it will be different. How she explained this to herself, the investigation didn't ask, and journalists didn't get an answer either. But the mechanism is clear. It is the same for thousands of women in similar situations. It was a long time ago, 14 years ago. He was young, stupid. Something went wrong. Since then, he's changed, served his time, realized it, become different. There were circumstances. Maybe he was provoked. Maybe he was defending himself. Maybe everything wasn't as it was written in the verdict. Every story has two sides. He's not like that. I see him every day, see how he talks, how he smiles, how he behaves. He's calm, kind, attentive. Could such a person really be capable of evil? So this phrase was not naivety. It was a mantra, a spell that Ekaterina repeated to herself to drown out what she knew, to turn knowledge into non-knowledge, so that the facts from his case became just words that mean nothing. She was not stupid, and she was not uneducated. She worked in the system, saw criminals every day, understood that people rarely change, understood that recidivism is a statistic, not an exception. But loneliness proved stronger. 40 years old, a small town, an empty apartment, a desire for a normal life, a desire for someone to be nearby, to have someone to wake up for. And when such a person appeared, she closed her eyes to his past, to the warnings of the system, to everything that should have stopped her. She opened the door of her home to him, to her daughters, to Vikica, who knew nothing and could not protect herself. And when what happened happened, she couldn't admit the truth, because admitting it meant accepting. She brought him in herself. She herself left her daughter with a person about whom she knew everything. She herself opened the door through which tragedy entered. Defending Silnov after everything that happened is not madness. It is the last wall between Ekaterina and the truth about herself. If he is innocent, if it was an accident, if Vikica did it herself, then she too is innocent. Then it wasn't her choice that led to such an end. But it was her choice. If you have watched to this point, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what you think about this story. And until next time.